Hello there. Greet you in the name of our Christ. Thank you for joining us as far as our noonday nighttime Bible study is concerned. Greatly appreciative of all of those who are online with us. We greet you with Jesus' joy. Greet you with Jesus' joy. And what a blessed privilege it is for us to have you on this particular time. As far as the time that is mine is concerned, to share with you what I sense that the Lord would have for us to do. And we're going to go ahead and get started as far as word of prayer is concerned. And once we have that prayer, then we're going to go ahead and get into the word. So, with that, let us go ahead and get connected to our God as far as our own personal devotional moment in prayer. God, we come to you and we thank you for this incredible opportunity to study your word, to grow as far as your word is concerned. And then, even more importantly than that, oh God, to gather and glean what you desire for us to know so that we can become what you would have for us to be. Show yourself strong and mighty as only you can, oh God, in this teaching moment. And we would bless your name for that. God, by the power and presence of your Holy Spirit, we pray that you will be the master teacher. Let your word really become the lamp unto our feet, the light unto our pathway, so that ultimately you can get the glory and the honor through our efforts and through our actions. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray, and in his name we claim it done. Amen. Amen. All right. So what I want to do as far as the time is concerned, what I want to do is I want to call your attention to Acts chapter 17. We want to go to Acts chapter 17 as we continue to work through Acts 17. And of course, we've been dealing with Paul as far as him engaging in a missionary venture, going through particularly Asia Minor. We first realized that Paul had done several things, that Paul had ministered in Thessalonica, then he goes to Berea. He is now going to Athens, and Athens is going to be a very great challenge for him. But he goes to Athens, and we're going to unpack what we see the Lord would do with him at Athens. There's some things that I want to highlight for you all as far as this moment is concerned. So, as we look at this particular text, Acts chapter 17, we want to start at verse 16. We're going to go from verse 16 to verse 21 today. And maybe a lot of note taking that you may want to do, because I wanted to give you some insights that will help you to appreciate all the different things that are in these verses, as these 6 verses from verse 16 to verse 21. So, with that, before we get started, I see we have people that are on our Zoom connection. We have others that are joining us as far as Facebook is concerned and YouTube. So do me a favor, for those that are on Facebook and YouTube, if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat on YouTube. On Zoom. You can also go to the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can ask your question directly, and I can answer it in real time. So with that, let's go ahead and let's get ready to unpack what I sense the Lord will have for us to appreciate as far as Paul's journey to Athens. Starting at verse 16. I'll tell you to highlight some words or underline some words or circle some words, just so that you can be able to lift that up in your own personal reading and really appreciate what is brought as far as that aspect is concerned. So, Acts chapter 17, starting at verse 16. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens. His spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Underline Paul, circle Athens, highlight his spirit was provoked within him when he saw the city was given over to idols. All right. Verse 17. Therefore, he reasoned, underline the word reason, in the synagogue with the Jews, underline synagogue with the Jews, and with Gentile worshipers, underline that too. And in the marketplace daily, I want you to circle the word marketplace. With those who happen to be there. Verse 18. Then there were certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. Underline Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And some said, what does this babbler say? Circle the word babbler. Others said, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. I want you to highlight that. Highlight that. Highlight that. And they took him, talking about Paul, and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, and I want you to circle the word Areopagus. Yeah, circle the word Areopagus. That we may know this new doctrine of which you speak, for you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore, we want to know what these things mean. Highlight all of that. Verse 21, for all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but to either tell or hear something new. Just circle that verse. Just circle that whole verse because I want to really dissect that. Okay. All right. Now, we got a whole lot of stuff that we want to unpack here. Sorry about that. All right. Got a whole lot of stuff that we want to unpack here. And what I want to do is I want to kind of throw out some things that I want us to give consideration to. So remember, in the earlier lessons before, Paul faced hostility in Thessalonica to the point that they drove him out the city. They took Jason them into custody. Jason and his crew had to pay a bond with the promise that Paul would not come back to Thessalonica. Y'all remember that? Then Paul goes to Berea. He has better success at Berea. But then the folks from Thessalonica found out that he was in Berea, and they came and stirred up mess. So now they had to come take Paul out of Berea. They send him to Athens. Athens is a key city in Greece. Athens is a very important city because Athens was really the city of learning. Okay. And even though the Roman Empire is basically the empire of the day, that whenever you wanted to get some good learning, some deep learning, you went to Athens. Okay. So Athens is a very important place. And what we want to do is I want to help you to lift up the nuances of what was going on in Athens so that we can really appreciate how Paul did evangelism. So think about the hostility Paul had in Thessalonica and Berea, and the fact that he is by himself when he goes to the pagan city of Athens. And can you imagine how Paul felt when he began to talk about Jesus Christ and his resurrection in Athens? And that's what we're going to highlight. But he not only did that in the synagogue, but he also did it in the marketplace. All right. So not only did he go to the synagogue where the Jews were, but he also went to the marketplace where they would have gatherings for various debates and conversations about new ideas. Now, using your imagination and information, can you imagine the scene of the people, the sights, the sounds of the marketplace, people hustling and bustling, buying fish, buying clothes, buying dyes, exchanging money, and then in various quarters of the marketplace, you got people expounding different ideas, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and then here comes Paul talking about Jesus Christ and his resurrection. That's the kind of environment that Paul is dealing with in this particular setting. Now, what I want to do, as far as our time together is concerned, is to really start moving and challenging us to really appreciate all that Paul had to deal with when he was doing this work as far as Athens was concerned. And it is my hope and prayer that I can shed some insights as far as that's concerned. So, Paul is going to Athens. And Athens, particularly during the 5th and 4th centuries, that was the glory for Greece. That was the center of Hellenism. It was a cultural center, had one of the major universities back in that day. The architecture, the art form was beautiful, but Paul could not enjoy any of that because look at verse 16. His spirit was provoked when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Now, how does he know the city is given over to idols? Well, first of all, the name of the city, Athens, is named after the Greek goddess Athena. And Athena was the goddess of war. So just the name of the city, Athena, being the goddess of war, kind of had him a little on edge. Okay? So even though Paul's brief stay at Athens is a remarkable case study of how universal the gospel can be. Okay? Athens was like New York. Okay? Athens was like New York. Very cosmopolitan. A whole lot of different philosophies. And people were given to idolatrous beliefs. All right. So Paul is demonstrating his ability to be all things to all people in the sense of being able to shift where people are to be able to then allow for the gospel to be shared in those settings. So Paul preaching the gospel of the resurrected Christ with concepts and terms that the Athenian philosophers could easily understand. And as we get ready to go through this, some are going to look at him like he's crazy. Others are going to consider him to be someone interesting that they wanted to learn more about. So here's what I want you all to understand about Athens, because Paul said his spirit was provoked within him when he saw the city was given over to idols. In other words, that word provoke in the Greek means that he was deeply troubled. And he was deeply troubled, meaning that there was this violent emotion when he saw all the idolatry going on in the city. And he was filled with a combination of both anger and grief. So people were spiritually lost. They were blinded by Satan. They were trapped in paganism. And Paul was in a tizzy because he saw all of this. Now watch this. Athens was a place of highly educated people. But the highly educated people were ignorant of the true living God. Did y'all catch that? The highly educated people were ignorant of the true and living God, which means that your knowledge of who God is not predicated or based upon your education. It is interesting to note that Paul takes this inner turmoil that he's dealing with and he turns it into positive action. And he looked for opportunities to talk about Jesus. I like the way that Paul really navigates this particular moment. Though he's provoked, though he's angry, though he's upset, he uses that energy to share the gospel. So before we launch even deeper, what does people in your space who don't know who Jesus is, what does it cause you to do? What does it cause you to do? Do you shun unbelievers and not talk to them or talk ill about them? Or do you seek opportunities to share who Jesus is? Let me say it again. Do you shun unbelievers and talk ill about them? Or do you seek opportunity to speak the gospel to them? I never will forget. I was hanging out with some clergy friends of mine, and there were some other people that were around us. And so, we're talking about church, we're talking about Jesus and all this stuff. And so there was this brother who was having, was kind of ear hustling the conversation. And the brother, he was, drinking some libations. Okay. And in him drinking some libations, of course, he inserted himself into the conversation. And as he inserted himself to the conversation, he was talking about, how he used to go to church and all that stuff, but, he never really believed in all this stuff about Jesus. And so I started talking about who Jesus is and using, check this out, connections between philosophers that he may have been aware of, like Descartes, Hume, things that this brother was highly intelligent. And I was connecting Jesus with him, with all of that. And then he was listening to me. He was and then you know what he said to me? These were the words he said to me. And I'm not going to give you the X-rated version of what he said, but you can imagine. He said, "You believe that BS?" And you know what I said? "Yep, I sure do, and willing to stake my life on it." And he looked at me and his eyes bucked. I said, yeah. I said, Jesus is not some fictitious character in the past. I said, Jesus is as real now. I said, and the difference is that all those other folks that I named to you are dead and Jesus is still alive. He said, man, he said, well, why do we have all these wars and all this stuff behind religion? So I was then able to talk to him about how, unfortunately, Christianity has been corrupted by governments and peoples to perpetuate things that Jesus never had any intention of doing. However, let me say this. You can't do that if you don't know, number one, who Jesus is. And you can't do that, number two, if you don't know the Bible. And number three, you can't do that if you're a new Christian, because you're a weak Christian, because you ain't got much in your bag. Remember, Paul studied several years with Ananias and other apostles before he started going to do these missionary trips. Because if you don't know what you if you don't know what you don't know, and if you're not sure about what you do know, and your faith is not strong, anybody can knock you off your point. So Paul was able to stand against the Athenians, the Thessalonians, the Bereans, because he knew what he believed and he knew why he believed what he believed. Am I making any sense? And let me, if I could, really help you quick, fast, and in a hurry. There is a difference between you having theological, scriptural convictions and you giving a testimony. Your testimony ain't preaching and ain't sharing the gospel. No. Your testimony is not you preaching and sharing the gospel. Okay? Testimony is good because it's a personal experience, but your testimony is not the gospel. All right? Okay. So let's unpack this. Let's unpack this. Athens, if you ever go to Greece, go to the city of Athens. They still got some stuff up from those days. Athens, as wonderful as it was, the work of art that it had, the architecture that it had, it was steeped in godless idolatry. There were temples in Athens for all the gods of the Greek pantheon. Now, I love to read Greek mythology because when I read Greek mythology and Roman mythology, it tickles me how they perceive and view their various gods. And I just laugh at this stuff. I'm going like, these jokers are more out of sync than human beings. I love to read Greek mythology and Roman mythology because the way their gods act, I'm going like, shoot, we as human beings, we ain't so bad off because they had their gods doing some crazy stuff. And that's the differentiation between the real, true living God and their gods. They got a whole bunch of gods. We only got one God. One God. So, named after the goddess Athena, whole lot of gods, a whole lot of different temples in Athens that were dedicated to these various gods. Paul was deeply troubled, upset in his spirit. And so Paul, being the representative of God, could not help but to be mad and angered at such a great city and a great culture that was worshiping anything and anyone rather than the true and living God. So that anger would not let Paul be quiet for long. Okay? So here comes Paul in the city of Athens with its beautiful buildings, its whole lot of gods, center for Greek culture, philosophy, and education. And the educated folks were always open to hearing something new. And it was their openness to hear Paul speak at their meeting in the Areopagus. All right. So Athens was a political, educational, and philosophical center of the world in its prime. Athens was the home of men like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Epicurus, Zeno. Now I'm gonna talk about these folks in just a moment. All right. So when Paul arrived, um, Athens was not what it used to be, but they like to relive their glory days in the center of the Areopagus, talking about what used to be and engaging in philosophy. Sort of like what some church folks like to do in today's culture. Talk about what used to be. Okay. Now, let's look at verse 17. Let's look at verse 17. Bible says, therefore he, Paul, reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. All right. Now, let's look at this. So Paul had a balance, and he knew how to adapt his ministry in Athens. In the synagogue, he reasoned or debated with the Jews and the worshiping Gentiles, likely using arguments that he had done in the book of Acts, particularly verses chapter 13, 14, 15, and 16. All right. He was seeking to prove that the Jesus they had long been looking for, the Messiah they had long been looking for, was Jesus Christ, whom the Jews had put to death. Now, remember, for the Jews, their Sabbath was on a Saturday. So that means he had Sunday and the rest of the week to go out into the marketplace or the public square or the agora, which was the central marketplace, and talk about Jesus to whomever would listen. All right. Now, here's what I want to impress upon you all about this word reason. In the synagogue, he was debating, discussing, listening, yet firmly stating his convictions about Jesus. He wasn't beating folks over there. He wasn't doing like the black Hebrew Israelites do. Okay. The men y'all see uptown in purple and gold. And I never forget the first time I saw them, I almost rolled down my window and said, "Hey, Q's," but then I realized they weren't the bros. So they weren't doing like the Hebrew Israelites, and they weren't doing like some other people, other Christians, carrying a big old Bible and hitting it over the head. No. Here's what I want to impress upon you if you don't get anything else today. If you're going to effectively evangelize, you don't have to yell, you don't belittle, you don't attempt to ram down beliefs down somebody's throat. That's not evangelism. Okay, that's harassment. All right. And may I suggest that it's that type of thinking that is probably why so many people in the church are afraid to share the gospel with their unbelieving friends and neighbors in spiritual conversations. I would say part of the reason that many believers, many people that come to St. Paul may be afraid to share all of that. Number one, I know I may get in trouble for this. Many folks don't know what they really believe. They're not grounded in their convictions. Okay? Which means, listen, if you don't come to Bible study, if you don't come to Sunday school, if you're not, getting any teaching, if you're not having your own personal time with God, you can't stand. The Hebrew Israelites can talk you off your point because they make stuff sound real good unless you know better. Jehovah's Witnesses make stuff sound real good unless you know better. You can't get caught up in a cult. You don't fall for a cult if you know better. Am I making any sense? So here's what I want to impress upon you all today. The good news about the gospel is that you can share it in an unoffensive manner. It's conversation. ain't got to yell. You don't have to yell. You don't have to, belittle folks. You don't have to say, you don't have to put down folks in sharing the gospel. Am I making any sense? Okay. Now, we get ready to get to some good stuff. In verse 18, it says, then certain Epicureans and Stoic philosophers encountered him. Stop right there, because I want to explain to you who these Epicureans and Stoic philosophers are. Because the Epicureans and the Stoic philosophers, they were, how can I say, they were the dominant philosophical strand of that day. Okay, they were sort of like in Christianity today. If we would take Christianity and talk about the dominant strands of Christianity, they were like the Catholics and the Protestants of Christianity. So back during that time, the Epicureans and the Stoics were the dominant philosophical strand or thread of that day. So the Epicureans, this is what they believe. You may want to put this in your notes. The Epicureans believed that the chief purpose of living was for pleasure and happiness. Do what you want, how you want, with whom you want, as long as you want, as long as it makes you happy and don't harm nobody else. That was the Epicureans. The Epicureans wanted to live life to the fullest. And they believed that if there were gods, that gods did not interfere in human affairs. Okay? So the Epicureans are kind of similar. We're similar to today's folks who are caught up in materialism and hedonism. All right. So that's one strand. The other strand, which is totally opposite, were the Stoics. And the Stoics followed this guy named Zeno. They were, how can I say, very austere. Very austere. They believed that it was our responsibility as human beings to align ourselves with purposes that were moving toward history. So here is what the Stoics were. They were very logical, very self-disciplined, very self-sufficient. They probably were the earlier conveyors of Henley's "I am the master of my fate, I'm the captain of my soul." They were modern. They were like New Age followers and pantheists today. And pantheists basically believe that there are a whole bunch of different ways to God. Okay? All right. So you got Epicureans on one side, you got Stoics on the other, then you got everybody else in the middle. All right. Now, here's what I want to impress upon you all. Because this is who Paul had to have conversation with as far as verse 18 is concerned. In verse 18, it says the Epicureans and the Stoics encounter him, and some say, what does this babbler want to say? Others say he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. So here is what the Epicureans and the Stoics started doing. They began to have debate with Paul. All right. They began to have conversation with Paul around these various ideas. And this phrase, what does this babbler have to say? That was the ultimate put down back then. Because they were basically saying that Paul's arguments was like he didn't know what he was talking about. The word Babel literally means seed picker. It was a picture of a bird fluttering around, picking up shreds of food with no thought of order or consistency. It wasn't a compliment. It was a bird collecting seeds. It's like a junk collector gathering trash. They accused Paul of taking a little bit of knowledge here, a little bit of knowledge there, and not knowing what he was talking about. They were saying that his ideas were not coherent. They were not well thought out. They were not logical. That's what they were saying about Paul. All right. He was like a bird picking at the ground and trying to see what came out. In other words, he was throwing stuff up against the wall to see what stuck. That's what they were saying about Paul. All right. So that's the image. That's the image. Now, when you know what you know, what you know about Jesus, folks will say that about you. Just like that guy said, "You believe that BS?" And I was like, "Yep, yep." So carrying on. So they were looking for logic. Let me see. Well, I wouldn't say that they were looking for. I wouldn't say that they were looking for knowledge or for logic, rather. Because remember, Epicureans didn't care about logic. They care about happiness. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. The Stoics were looking for logic. So you have both Epicureans and Stoics debating with Paul. Let me take Sister Gaynor. Sister Gaynor says, it's sometimes difficult to interject Christian belief in everyday conversations. How should we do this without sounding holier than thou? Let me help you quick, fast, hurry. Stop trying to. Here's what we got to understand. We're called to be holy. We're called to be holy. And my living the way that God would have for me to live is at times going to cause me to sound better than others. And we got to stop using that as a disparaging remark. We're called to be holy. There ought to be something looking better in our lives and in our conversations. That people here's the thing. Darkness hates light. Talk, Pastor. And light is a whole lot better than darkness. And folks ought to see something in us that says, you've had an encounter. Now, holier than thou, ain't nothing wrong with being holier than thou. Just don't think you're better than anybody else as far as what God has done in your life. But when we talk about holier than thou, it's just plain conversation. And when folks start getting loud, you ain't got to get loud with them. I love the way Tony Dungy used to coach when he was coaching the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Indianapolis Colts. It was said that Tony Dungy never hardly raised his voice, and he didn't cuss folks out. He had this way of talking to folks that got his point across. Okay? And it was just like when that guy, and I don't know if he was caught up in the sauce at the moment when he said, "You believe that BS?" But that wasn't what he said. And I said, "I absolutely do." I didn't cuss back at him. I just kept my normal conversational tone and said, "Yeah, man, I believe that." And it stunned him because I ain't come back with him with the same verbal veracity that he came at me. Okay. All right. So in this conversation, you got, again, Epicureans. They're only concerned about happiness. They're materialistic. They're hedonistic. Again, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we will die. And then you had the Stoics, who were very logical, very self-disciplined. They showed no emotion. All right. So you had, but they were calling Paul, both of them were calling Paul a seed picker, a junk collector. Okay. But then others recognized Paul's teaching about Jesus and the resurrection and said he was advocating what? Foreign gods, a different God, a God that was different from the Greek pantheon. Because remember, well, I don't know if you all ever read Greek mythology or Roman mythology, but they had a God for everything. Had a God for the sun, a God for the moon, a God of war, a God of fertility, a God of agriculture, a God of the shepherds, a God of music, a God of art. I mean, they had a whole bunch of gods. And here comes, for those philosophers, another kind of God. Now, that's going to be very important when we do the teaching next week. This is going to be very important. for when we do the teaching next week. Let me say it one more time. This is going to be very important for the teaching that we do next week. So they are at the Areopagus, and they said to Paul, in so many words, um, um, may we know what this new teaching you're talking about? Because you're talking some strange stuff to our ears, and we want to know what it means. So check this out. Paul's conversation in the marketplace, him talking about Jesus in the marketplace, allowed him to come and address the Areopagus, which was the legislative seat of government in Athens. It was like a council. And by Paul's time, basically what they did in the Areopagus was just have conversation about philosophy or religion or education. All right. So these, quote, intellectuals were interested in hearing this new teaching about Paul. Did y'all catch that? They were interested in hearing these new teachings about Paul. They wanted to know, who is this Jesus you're talking about? And Paul is getting ready to drop on them how God entered the human predicament to redeem fallen humanity and put them in position to know not philosophy, not religion, but a person, Jesus Christ. In verse 21, we see, as Luke is writing all of this, Luke talks about the Athenians and the foreigners who like to spend their time just talking, debating ideas. Here's the blessing in all of this. Evidently, these intellectuals who love to talk and discuss the latest philosophy or theology, the picture is that they rarely did anything with what they talked about. They just love to toss around ideas. And may I suggest that in the church we do this. We love we trying to be careful how I say this. Folks will come to different Bible studies or even church, hear a good sermon that shares with them some things that God expects for them to do. And the only thing is say, woo, we had good church today, but they ain't gonna do nothing with it. Woo, we had good church today. And they leave the same way they came in, rather than being convicted to make a change. So that's what Luke writes about in verse 21. These Athenians and foreigners, they love to talk about these ideas, but the ideas wouldn't cause them to make significant change for the better. All right, so we're gonna stop right there. We're gonna pick up next week, starting verse 22. Read from verse 22 through the end of the chapter to verse 34. But before I close out, let me see if there are any questions that anyone has, either online or on the Zoom call. Brother Amos, yeah, unmute yourself.
All right, Pastor. About once a month, I get some Jehovah's Witnesses ringing my doorbell. What I do now is just tell them no, thank you.
Yeah, that's fine.
But should I?
No.
Because I know what I know that I know.
Yeah.
Just go ahead and say, this is what I believe and why I believe it, or should
Well, let me say to you, Brother Amos, it all depends on what you feel like doing that day. I wouldn't say you know, the easiest thing would be go like, yeah, God bless you all, keep on moving. Okay. The engaging thing, if you feel like now if you decide you want to invite them in, then just hunker down for about an hour and a half conversation. And if you're going to have that hour and a half conversation, then make sure from a theological and a scriptural perspective, you know, you can you can be able to have those deep conversations with them. Yeah. I remember when I was a young boy, teenager, they used to come over to my Momo's house and Momo would invite them in and they would leave the Watchtower magazine and they were trying to convince me, even as a teenager, that I need to become a Jehovah's Witness. And as soon as they left, Momo going like, well, um, you don't be believing that stuff. I just try to be nice to them. Okay. But Momo would tell me, don't be believing. She said, and this is exactly how she said, don't be believing that stuff. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. All right. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Any other questions or comments? So read verses 22 through 34. We should have some good conversations about this next week, and it's my hope and prayer that we'll be able to do that deep dive. All right. Well, listen, as we close out, want to give you an opportunity if you feel led to give. You can give as far as Bible study is concerned. You can mail a check or money order to the church, 1401 Alice Street, Charlotte 28205. Or you could drop off check, cash, or money order at the church Monday through Thursday between the hours of 9 to 4. Call the church office to make sure someone is here, 704-334-5309. Or you could give online through ACS and Church Life, or you can give through Giveify. However you give, if you're giving on your envelope, just put it under TNT Bible Study, as well as those various electronic platforms. Put it on either TNT or Bible Study, and so you can get credit for this particular moment. All right. Well, listen, thank you all for joining us. We'll pick back up on this next Thursday as we walk through how Paul handled evangelism. And my hope and prayer is to give you insights on what you can do to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all on Sunday, either in person, preferably, or online, if that's the way you can join us. All right. Take care.